of November. What a month it is going to be. I'm sure of that. With all the craziness you guys are about to deal with here over the next 30, 60 days, I thought it would be necessary to bring in a professional. So this week I'm going to bring you a sit down with my very own therapist, Jessica. It was an awesome discussion. When you talk about, as someone who's a sales nerd, right? Also having addiction in my past and a part of my bloodline, to see the two compared side by side, to have a discussion with someone who really understands it from a, I don't want to say a doctor position, but from a, something more than just a conversation between you and I, it really means a lot. So please do yourself a favor, sit down. This is a long episode. Watch it twice, watch it 3 times, watch it in pieces. Whatever you do, just make sure you absorb the whole thing. It is truly, truly that great. So once again, this is a sit down with my therapist, Jessica. Sit down and enjoy. Welcome in again, my friends, to another sit-down edition. Do not adjust your TV screens, cell phones, however you are watching this. Yes, we are live, somewhere different than my office. Frankly, the only place I've been outside my office probably in the last 6 months, and the reason I put on jeans is why we're here today to talk with my therapist and someone who I think is really, really smart. I think you guys will really, really enjoy it. Bring in Jessica. Jessica, how are you?
I'm doing well today. Thanks for asking.
Wonderful. Thank you for doing this. And again, this is full disclosure. We are as COVID protocol as we can be here, but we wanted you guys to be able to hear the conversation, so we don't have the masks on now. Producer is in the mask, if anyone is wondering. She is fully masked up and rocking, rolling. So we're going to jump right into this. Jessica, how long have you been doing what it is that you do?
6 years.
6 years.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I have been working together for the last, almost 2. Right? Thereabouts. And it's interesting because we talk about everything from business to personal. It started off as a business conversation. It's morphed into more. When you look at, because you do therapy across the board for different ages, different people, is business therapy something much different than personal therapy? I think a lot of people kind of get concerned that there are two differences. Is there really a difference between the two, or is it just a conversation amongst people?
I think it's a conversation amongst people because if you think about how and where you spend your time, you spend on average 40 hours a week at work. So that is a significant period of time throughout any week. You spend more time at work than you do at home. So if somebody comes in talking about a personal issue, more than likely we're going to also be talking about work. If somebody comes in to talk about a work issue, then we're more than likely going to be talking about personal stuff at some point. It's more related, there's a flow, kind of circles back around. If things are happening at home, they're probably happening at work, vice versa. People have patterns of behavior, and they don't just disappear when you walk through the front door of your home or the front door of your office.
As much as we may try to put those places in certain compartments and kind of do the thing, it's hard. And especially as you know, my situation is live, work, live with the wife, the producer, the business partner, and that makes the division almost impossible. I think a lot of people have said it to me along the way, hey Sean, how is it you divide work and home? At this point, we don't.
Well, it's hard because there's really no division.
There is no going home, but I like how you say that about the mindset, right? Of who you are. I always make this joke about people who have a messy office. Their car's probably messy too. And their house is probably messy as well. And not in a bad way. I don't mean that. People say that they, in dealerships, our business managers always had just paperwork everywhere. Mm-hmm. Made sense to them. That's what they'd always say. They're like, man, this is cool. You guys are driving me nuts in this room. It all makes sense to us. That to me seems like an easy way to kind of excuse the behavior along the way and not really dive into it. But when you and I were talking last about behavior and attitudes and kind of how it goes, you made mention to me about sales and addiction sort of not sharing a same space in the brain, but being on the same wavelength as far as how we process things. Can you sort of give us some background and really kind of dive into that part of it? Because as an addict and as a sales professional, and I don't, by the way, just so we're all clear, when I say addict, I don't mean I have a drug problem currently. As an addict, you never get rid of the title as far as I'm concerned. You're always dealing with it. It's a conversation I've had with my dad as well. So addiction is never, it's not cured. It's not like it goes into remission. It's not to be cured. So can you give us some background on that conversation and kind of lead us into that?
Sure. So every person has a brain, and there are different parts of the brain that control different ways in which we perceive, recall, remember, and think about things, whether that's through to the consequence or on the impulse. So depending on when a person starts, it starts in more or less in adolescence. So there's the prefrontal cortex and the frontal cortex. That is responsible for decision making, thinking through consequences, and when the brain develops, it develops from the back to the front. So that prefrontal cortex, thinking about consequences, the reasons why you're doing something and thinking about something clearly, is the last to develop. And it's developing throughout adolescence and doesn't stop developing till 25 to 27. So
the last thing to develop in the brain, I'm sorry, I want to make sure I understood this correctly because this is what gets me, is the decision-making part of the brain.
Yes.
I mean, I guess if you look at it, that makes a ton of sense, you know? I did a lot of dumb shit when I was 15. I didn't really think about the consequences, but I thought about the excitement behind whatever it is I was about to do. All right, so today we learned something. So that's 25 to 27. All right, sorry, go ahead.
Right. So from there, you think about, okay, so what drives people? And that is the response or reward center of the brain. And that is deeper in the brain, of the front of the brain that lies underneath that frontal cortex, and that's called the striatum.
Okay.
When you get rewarded, dopamine is produced, which is this neurotransmitter that is like responsible for joy, for woohoo, like I like this feeling and I want to feel more of this.
Sure.
The reward center produces dopamine when you exercise, and those effects can last for 30, 60 minutes even after your workout. So learning about the adolescent, learning about the young adult, we also need to learn about what do they consider as a reward. Adolescents are oftentimes categorized as impulsive, risk takers. Well, part of this is due to that they have an active reward center. That striatum is bing, bing, bing. It's going all the time. So it responds to things like money. When a teenager or a young adult sees money, they value that more than older adults. So that pleasure center, that reward center is rewarded when they see a big stack of money. Dopamine goes off.
Sure.
And now there's that connection with money, makes me feel good. So now that brings us to talking about how biases are formed, or what's reinforced that makes us like something over another. It's the same thing that happens with brands like Adidas or Nike, something like that.
Sure.
In middle school or high school, it's all about, hey man, those are cool shoes. What are they? Nikes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, Adidas. I got a pair of Adidas shoes when I was in middle school. That's what I wanted. That's what I got. It had 4 stripes.
Right.
Not Adidas. So, I don't necessarily now have a super cool feeling about Adidas because I was not rewarded. That dopamine was not produced. So that makes us more prone to liking one product over another depending on how good it makes us feel and those other chemicals. Same things with substances. Substances can help us to feel really good, and we oftentimes have that first high is like the most dopamine, the most everything, which then after that we have a bias or perhaps even a preference when we see that, and that dopamine response goes off. Same thing with love. If you look, every time you look at your wife, dopamine.
Sure.
Whoa, there you are. You
sure.
know?
Yeah.
Sure,
plenty.
Yeah, so
Plenty.
You also now have a bias towards your wife. So if anybody tries to come at her, insult her, whatever, there you are. Don't tread. This protective factor even starts to happen.
Because of the kind of domino effect, if you will, of the original dopamine hit. So, there's
other neurotransmitters involved, but dopamine is a big one.
Sure. I mean, look, if let's say there's 10, dopamine's probably the largest of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of things there's a lot there. So I'm gonna try and go back. I've already filled up the page here. So I'm gonna try and go back. So you talked about the idea that in the moment, the dopamine lasts. And in the car business, we always said the best time to sell a car is right after you sold your last one.
Right, you're still riding that high.
Right, and so we would say that because it was, that was kind of our motivation. But at the end of the day, you're talking about it being an actual psychological advantage to being back in front of another human being to do your job in that, let's just call it a 60-minute window, whether it's 30, 60, let's just call it a 60-minute window, an hour. That's a really cool way to think about going about your job. And I always thought we were just kind of, rah-rahing each other, but to know that there's real value to that. And again, as someone who's done his amount of drugs, sure, what have you, that first high is memorable. Mm-hmm. You could tell the story of it, in most cases, because you just remember it, it's vivid, it's this, it's that, but after a while it just becomes the job, like it doesn't, the awareness, it wears off, like you said, it just ends up being 4 stripes, or it just ends up being a shoe. Mm-hmm. And so that part to me is very interesting. How can you control it? And I mean, dopamine, like, can you harness it? Can you, what can we do is anything we can do in that regard, I guess? It sounds crazy to say out loud, but anything we can think about that would help us to harness it or work through it.
I think being able to name it. Anytime you're able to name something, you can tame it. That's a term from Dr. Dan Siegel. In order to tame it, we have to name it. So to name it is to tame it, right? So if somebody is struggling with something, and then someone is able, or that person or someone else is able to name it, there can be relief. It's, I think, why therapy can be so beneficial. Someone comes in, I don't know why I feel this way. Well, let me hear what you have to say, see what we can come up with. At the end of a session, it's usually, at least to me, the outcome is that something was able to have clarity, have understanding, and this person, I feel understood. To answer your question, I think to name it is a way to help tame it. So being able to be like, yeah, wow, like that was such a great experience.
Right. Well, that's when you said it like that. When you talked about the dopamine going off in our original conversation, that was my name it moment. Mm-hmm. That's where I was like, okay, this is something I've been dealing with my whole life. The highs in my brain they're high, right? Mm-hmm. And the lows, I don't get, this producer's shaking her head, I don't get low on that end, so I'm always kind of mid to high, and then the highs, that's where I've always been searching for that next, sounds terrible, but the next high, that next, mm-hmm. because I just always am riding it close to the level.
Because your brain is looking for it, because your brain, so as we get older or as we go through life, our brain becomes equalized or balanced to the level of neurotransmitters that are being produced in the brain. So there's oftentimes this push to keep seeking, to keep gaining more whatever neurotransmitter that might be, in this case dopamine. It's the same thing that, like, if you make a sale and then you don't get another sale, then people start to feel very defeated and down. Yeah. And perhaps, even the search for the next sale might be, more lackluster, or maybe even more pronounced than before. But the brain is searching for the dopamine, it can't find it, so now we get the low. Same thing that happens if you break up with someone. Sure. The brain's going to try to look, that's why we want to try to call that person or look at old photos. It's that those neurotransmitters will guide our behavior. And
so a loss in any way, right? Correct. That's the same thing that happens if you lose someone in your life, right? A loved one. You're absolutely correct. You have that moment of search through the brain. You're cycling through all the files and records trying to remember, and then you feel this guilt, right? In that case, if you can't produce enough, energy around that, I hadn't thought about it that way. You've mentioned neurotransmitters a few different times, mm-hmm. and dopamine is, I understand that correctly, is one of them. Yep. Right? Mm-hmm. So what would be the next biggest one, and how is it impactful to this discussion?
Well, this one's more of a hormone, but it's called oxytocin. Oxytocin is the love hormone, or it's the hormone that gets produced that says you belong here, you have a place here, you are safe here, you're cared for, you are understood. That's one of the other neurotransmitters, hormones that are found within romantic relationships. However, we can find that amongst social groups as well. The brain is, and the human being is a social being. Oxytocin is something that is formed right away when a mother gives birth. It happens in that connection between mother and baby.
Sure.
So that's why there's this huge bond there. But that just keeps on going within social groups, like wanting to be cared for, wanting to be loved, wanting to fit in. One of the big things in adolescence, 18, I'm talking about probably more of emerging adulthood at this point, 18 to 25, 27, we want to be a part of the group. We want to know what our identity is, and we sometimes only know how to identify with those groups of people. And if we don't feel that warm feeling that we get from acceptance and care, then we feel like on the outside and cast away. So,
and I think that really starts in high school. I mean, you talk about the 18 to 27, but that's where that really the development of that begins, right? I look back on that. People always say, "Oh, were you a jock? Were you a nerd? Were you that?" I was a high school kid.
Yep.
I talked to everybody. I knew nerds. I knew jocks. I was a jock. Played baseball. Played basketball. Played football. But I didn't identify like that. I was just, my identification was me.
Yeah.
You know. And then when I started to give up the stigma of like having to be who everyone wanted me to be, and I started to grow my hair out, wear tie dye, put on a pair of patch pants, people were just like, "What is going on? Like, what's wrong with you? Where do you fit? You're not a hippie because during the day you're in suits and ties, but at night you're in tie-dye shirts. Who are you?" Thought, well, that's who I am. That's my individualism. There's so much right in that. So the oxytocin, let's be clear about something. Okay. You mentioned the word hormones, okay? The oxytocin is found in both men and women.
Absolutely.
Okay, because people hear hormones and they think it's a female thing. I want to be clear with all of you. It's not. It's for all of us. We all have hormones, and as we get older, those hormones change. So I just be clear that it's all tied to the same area. So you talked about the mother-child relationship, right? And because of oxytocin, because of that bond. So now we give my mom, who watches the show, as I joke, the only one who does, we give her yet another out, right? Because it wasn't her fault that she's crazy parent that she is. Love you, Mom. But the point is the bond there. I wonder, does that work into, in your opinion, to the workplace? So in the car business, we can tend to be a little, I don't know, cliquish. I don't know. You bring someone into a new store, if they haven't done it before, they haven't done this. Can you feel that way when you go to a new employment? Can you not feel that oxytocin? Can that hormone be affected in a work environment that way?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah?
Absolutely. There's a difference in terms of how a person feels if they walk into a room and no one looks up to say hello, or if they walk into the room and people turn around and say, "Hey, you're the new guy," or "You're the new gal." Like,
sure.
Welcome.
Sure.
Welcome. We're glad that you're here. I mean,
so culture.
Yeah.
Because we hear a lot about it in our business all the time. Change your culture, change your culture. Again, people aren't wrong, but I think people need to understand something. Changing culture to get people to flip their emotions, which is what you're referring to. That's the room of people who walk in and say hi, and the room of people who have their heads down. That's pretty embedded in who those people are by the time they're 25. Okay, right? We've agreed to that. So how do you get culture to shift in that regard? What can one do?
I think one can start behaving in a way that says, hey, like, this is how I would like to be treated, or this is how I think this other person would like to be treated. Like, putting
leadership.
Right, putting yourself in another person's shoes. That, like, if I had to rewind and be brand new again, and if I walked in, what would I hope to see?
Yeah.
What kinds of behaviors would I hope that happen? I really have never met anybody that really, truly, genuinely hoped that no one would notice them.
Right.
Like, just doesn't happen.
You may have today, though.
Yeah.
When you're my producer. You may have today for the first time in your life been like, maybe there's someone, but no, for the most part.
Well,
not in the literal sense.
Yeah.
The set of intensity thing, but your point is no one's ever come to you and been like, God, I hope just I can stay on the sidelines for this and I just get into a new job and no one even knows I'm there.
Well, and that probably comes from like anxiety or other ways that you were treated before in other contexts that now this is the association that you make in the brain or in your thoughts with meeting new people. But take away expectations, take away anxiety, take away past experiences. I think people would genuinely at least want to be welcomed by at least one person.
Yeah.
You know, like, hey, I noticed you. Not everybody wants to be welcomed with balloons and streamers, but not everybody wants to be like, oh.
Have your back turned when you walk by.
Yeah.
There's a medium we need to find. But work culture, I think people need to understand that work culture can really affect the psyche. And I think especially in the workplace, the car dealerships, it's very competitive. We live in a very 30-day cycle of, you know, I guess dopamine hits where you're like, sell a car, don't sell a car, sell a car, don't sell a car. When the things start to spin out, one of the things you talked about with dopamine is sort of when it doesn't find what it's looking for, what next can we do to manage that from a sales professional standpoint when we hit it, right? So everyone knows the story about Sean and his O for February. We all know I never sold a car in February, fine, don't care. But I spun out of control midway through the month and I knew it. But there was nothing, I wasn't prepared to make any changes. What could I have done in that February, say halfway through the month when I hadn't sold a car, to potentially reset the clock and give myself a chance to really dominate maybe the last 15? Like if I named it and tamed it, right? If I already knew that, I could say to myself, I screwed this up because I've had a bad attitude or I've whatever. Because like you said, after the first missing of 5 sales, which had never happened to me, I could have taken 100 more. The same thing was going to happen.
Yeah.
Just and I could feel people reading it from me as I sat in front of them. They were kind of like, this guy seems, you know, like he's too eager or he's too this. What do you think I could have done to maybe switch gears or maybe help myself out?
Well, definitely one thing is check yourself before you wreck yourself.
Okay, right, very well. Okay.
What that means is...
Great reference.
Check how you're speaking to yourself. Are you tying yourself to an imaginary whipping post in your brain and in your thoughts?
Oh my God.
Like, are you beating...
Wasn't very imaginary, but yeah. Yeah.
Are you beating yourself up? You know, are you...
But how do we get out of it? Yes. I answer your question right now. Yes, I am beating myself up. Now what?
Examine the evidence. Examine the facts. Pretend this is sort of like a crime scene. Detectives really don't walk onto the scene and be like, well, I have a feeling, or like this, you know.
I tell people all the time, save your feelings for your therapist.
Yeah.
Okay? All right? That's what I tell them.
Detectives can have a hunch, but
that
hunch...
But that doesn't get someone convicted.
Correct. It's the evidence.
The facts
it's the facts, right?
Okay.
You know, you've got to have the fingerprints. You got to have the hairs. Like, you've got to have...
the DNA.
You've got to build the case before you bring it to the judge, who then ultimately decides whether you're innocent or you're guilty, right? So, which, by the way, people say the word guilt all the time. I encourage people to ask themselves, did I do something legally or morally wrong? If I did, then I would, by the definition, be guilty. It's shame that I'm feeling, not guilt. But that's probably a whole nother...
That's probably a whole other thing here, but here we are. But the point that I get from that is that we use words to replace actual feelings because it's easier. For instance, my business partner lost a part of his family, and instead of sending a card that said sorry, because right when we started to write the card, I'm like, dude, he knows that. He knows for a fact that I'm sorry. How can I express myself in a different way?
Yeah.
And when he got the card and the flowers, he was like, dude, this was awesome. Like, and you know what? It means a lot coming from you guys because we know you've been there. We know you felt that.
That is empathy versus sympathy.
Once again, a whole nother show.
Yeah.
But okay, so you talk about check yourself before you wreck yourself. Examine the evidence to understand. Now look, unlike our judicial system here in the United States, in my brain, you are guilty until proven innocent, right? So in the middle of that month, I was just like, you are terrible at your job. How could you have done this? You moved your girlfriend here. You've blown up your life. How have you done this? And I'm not normally like that. But what happens in my brain, and maybe you can help me understand why that is that I skip from beating myself up to the utmost of arrogance where then I just don't get anything. Where I'm just like, how could I, of all people, have not sold a car in the last 25, like, so what happened there? How does the brain skip from, and you could just say, that's me. She's free to say that. She gets at least one of those for the whole episode. So if that's the case, you can use it now. But is there a natural step to that where you're kind of the steps of sales grieving, if I could call it that? No.
Sure. I mean.
No.
The thing about it is you have to at some point be your own hype man or hype woman as
Correct.
Well. Like.
No problems there.
Yeah.
I've got no problem with that.
There are often times that you can't really know where to go unless you get super lost or you get to the bottom or you hit a particular point where now you've got this view that says, all right, like, I guess this is the direction that I can go.
Sure.
So we can be our best friends and we can be our worst enemies.
Yeah, but you know what, I'm doing the math here? That February happened between the ages of 22 and 23.
Yeah. Your brain didn't even have the pathway to know how to deal with it at that point.
It's not even my fault. It's not even my fault. And I'm not giving you under 25 or some excuse to go do dumb shit. No one's talking about that. But your point is, you didn't have all the tools in the toolbox just yet to be able to overcome that. So when I say to you, how do I fix it? Your point is, well, you showed up the next month and sold a bunch of cars and made it up, so you clearly fixed something. But as I've gotten older, it never happened to me again. Mm-hmm. It's never, ever happened to me again in my life. And I wonder if it's because, A, learned experience, which I think is an important part of any development. I'm not a doctor, but in my life it feels that way.
Yeah.
Man, that's crazy to think about now that I go back and I do the math on it. So I want to wrap up a little bit of this here to kind of move us forward. So you talk about culture really tied to, I tie it to oxytocin, right? So this idea that our culture is that sort of welcoming, love, brandish. It doesn't mean that everyone, oh, yoo-hoo, love, love. It just means smile. Notice the next human.
Make eye contact with someone.
Especially now, right?
Yeah.
Especially now with the mask. Like, just, if you have a chance to do it, do it. You know?
I have resorted to now saying out loud to people, hey, I'm smiling at you.
Right.
Like, hey, nice to see you. Because if without a mask, you can just kind of do a head nod,
you can
or
do whatever.
A wave, or
not even get noticed by people who know you, which has happened to me already.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes it's okay to narrate what you're doing, especially because this is sort of the canvas or something. You get to take a look at it to see what's going on.
Yeah, it's funny. I wore a pumpkin mask the other day into the dealerships, and they were like, I kind of like this, but I feel like I'm talking to the Joker. I'm like, well, it is a pumpkin mask, not a Joker mask. Like, no, because it has a smile, and you do smile, but not that big and everything else. So you're absolutely right about that. So we're going to tie that in with that. The dopamine to the sales professional, as far as that goes, being the main neurotransmitter for them. And again, tying that in, the sale is that excitement of the moment, no different than the drug addiction or that drink or whatever people are looking for. But in order to be able to manage those, I need to be able to understand them and basically name them. Is that fair to say? So
yeah.
Sales professionals, when you get that sales hit, know that's what that is. Know that's the sales hit, and that it is going to go away. There is a wear-off period, and when it does, the body tends to go into a lull. Mm-hmm. I do my best to keep myself level as I get older. I try not to have as many peaks and valleys. I know, I stop, I can see you. I know, they're there, I know. But my point is, from the time I was 22, 23 years old, to the time I'm now in my 30s, late 30s, everything is as it is. So I'm improving, which I hope is the case. How do we start to remove, look, I'm a kid of therapy my whole life, okay? Mm-hmm. Whatever age you get the faces and they tell you to circle them. Okay, I don't know what age that is, but it felt real young. Where they're like, so how are you feeling today? And you're just like, I don't know.
This one seems
This
right.
guy's got a frown on his face. I don't know, right? So that's how long I've been going to therapy. But there's always been a weirdness. For the longest time, I don't even think I would tell people. Because when you did tell people, they would be like, therapy? What's wrong with you? And it's, I didn't come in here the first time when I met you with like a gaping problem. You know what I mean? It wasn't like there was some, oh my God, this is obviously what we need to work on and fix for you in the next whatever time. How can we remove the stigma? How can we move forward as a culture? And my goodness, especially now, I feel like it's so much more important. And remember, it doesn't have to be this way, right? Teleconferencing is picked up immensely in your world, right? On phone, online, all of that is picked up. What can we do? What can we do to remove the stigma? You're younger, I'm younger-ish. What can we do?
I think talking about it, having it be a part of conversation, but also doing your due diligence to learn about it and to be honest with yourself about how perhaps struggles have been impactful to you. I teach a class called Abnormal Psychology, and the whole point of the class is to say, hey, I'm up here wanting to have a conversation with all of you and help you understand what does this look like, not just from the diagnostic manual perspective, but like, what if you encountered this? Then what would you do about it? People can take mental health first aid classes. It's an 8-hour course. You get certified for 3 years. It's much like a first aid CPR kind of course to get certified.
So how to deal with someone that might be in front of you, or having a situation that you walk in upon, for you to help understand that.
Exactly, because honestly, people don't know. So within mental health first aid, they have this acronym called ALGEE, ALGEE, that helps walk people through how to address things with other people, and that is so. And the reason why the ALGEE method is so helpful is because, number one, people don't know how to assess for risk. People are afraid of asking people, how do you feel? People are afraid to ask people, hey, have you ever thought about hurting yourself? Or have you ever hurt yourself? People are afraid to ask that because they don't want to put the idea in that person's mind, which that's not the case. People also don't know how to listen in a non-judgmental way. People have this notorious way of listening so that they can have a reaction. No, it's about listening and having a response to what the person was saying, not, ooh, while you're talking, let me think of what I'm going to say back to you. Giving assurance or validation, like letting somebody know, like, wow, that is really tough. I can't imagine what that would be like. Or having validation that what a person is feeling is not an argument because they shouldn't be feeling that way. It's acceptance because they are feeling that way.
Telling someone how they feel is probably one of the biggest mistakes I think a lot of people, especially in my industry, make. Because I think our industry is macho. We have a lot of great women, which is what we'll be highlighting over the next couple of weeks on our show. But it's one of those things that it is a boys' club, and they act as such. You know what I mean? And it gets to me worrisome that stuff still exists. I say it all the time to her, where I'm like, I can't believe I just saw this, or I can't believe I just heard this. This is things that were going on in the late 90s when I was in dealerships. People always say to me, can you imagine what it was like in the 80s? No, I can't. The late 90s were already wild as I could understand. What it must have been like in the 60s, 70s. It's probably crazy. But it doesn't change the fact that we need to evolve, and that we need to be more open in communication. The non-judgmental conversation I find fascinating, because I think that, again, in myself over the years, I've become a much better listener. Is trying to do that without formulating a response, which then tends to get me to think more about my response, right? As opposed to formulating it, now it's rip-roaring. I'm not actually hearing the last of what's being said. That's some of what you and I have really talked about for myself, that I have been needing to improve on, is this idea that, hey, you don't need to just jump at it. You can sit back, you can let the game come to you, filter it, and then respond to it. Where does that reaction come from? Why is it that we don't have non-judgmental conversations as much as we should? Why is that, do you think?
I think that's a complicated question, but my first initial reaction or response to that is because I think people like to label things so that they can make sense of it. Or people don't know what to do with the words that people are saying, right? Because maybe they don't describe to that belief or that value or that priority the way that that other person does. So, and it goes back to what we bias, right?
Correct. The way back around to the beginning.
Right, which is like, I'm going to value something over another thing, and, you know, having this conversation doesn't feel good. I don't feel like I'm being rewarded by this in the moment. So then people, I think, sometimes clam up and don't want to talk about it, or it's different than what they value or believe.
And obviously bias right now, as you and I are sitting here in this country, are probably at their highest given what we have coming up here in a couple of weeks. So I think a lot of just predetermined, right? It's always, this is how you're going to feel about it. You're going to automatically argue about a political discussion. You're not going to have a discussion. You're going to be biased, which then makes you judgmental by default, right? You can't have, I mean, once you have your bias into your discussion, you're not, you're being very judgmental because your bias has now gotten out in front of you.
Right, but to that particular point though, it's when we're listening to people, when we're having conversations with people, I think it's about finding the common threads that connect two people to one another, and finding that, like, well, is there a mutual goal? Is there a goal here? Or what is the thing that binds us together? Is there a kernel of truth? Is there a piece of truth that's true?
Yeah, it's the full circle for me, though, in the discussion, because you talk about common thread, and as sales professionals, that's the number one thing you're ever taught, right? Is get common ground. Mm-hmm. Whatever you do, in the first 5 minutes, find something that will unite you. Mm-hmm. Sports, let's stay away from politics, religion, but sports, kids, not kids, fast cars, not fast cars, where you live, where they live, whatever it was, you needed to have it. If you made it, the faster you could make that connection, to me, the easier the job was, because then you're talking just two people. It's not a salesman and a customer. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important part of the approach, right? I mean, is to make that common thread, but I don't think enough people apply what they do at work, in this case, to what they should be doing outside of work. Mm-hmm. When you are, if I treated every human being like a car deal, I'd be the best listener on earth, because during a car deal, it's all I'm doing. Mm-hmm. It's all I'm doing. I'd sit in the back of test drives with a notepad just like this, writing everything the two of them said, because ultimately they forget I was back there because I didn't talk. They said, "Go drive where you want. It's your car," right? People, "Oh, it's my car." It's like, yeah, it's your car, right? But it's the mental side of the game where we're establishing mental ownership. We talk about sales like it's not something completely psychological, when it's all that it is. But being psychological means that the brain has to be fit, in my opinion. And you have to understand the dopamines, the neurotransmitters, the oxytocin, so that you can see what you're leveraging and harnessing in the moment. Is that part of just, when you say talk more about, is that what we should be talking more about? Is labeling dopamine, labeling the oxytocin, so people understand how they feel about it? Is that what you mean? That's
one way, and that could be helpful or beneficial if that's what that particular person, would find rewarding, right? So we also have to be talking with people in ways in which they identify with that. So not everybody might be so inclined to understand or really even value the talk about neurotransmitters. It might be finding, that this person talks about what they value or what is their priority, and then building off of that and using the person and their interests, but then also saying, like, okay, well, what do you think about that? Like,
but genuinely caring, though, when you ask what you think about that. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like a lot of people, especially because we deal with a lot of sales pitches in our world, I feel like people just put those pleasantries on, like, how do you feel about that? And you go to answer it, and they're just like, okay, great. It's like, well, do you want to, if you're going to ask me how I feel, shouldn't we have a discussion about where we head from here? But it seems like it's just a question to get an answer. And that gets frustrating sometimes. Is there anything specifically you think amongst the males in this world that we can do on the therapy side? Because I tend to see clearly more females, that in my experience are in therapy versus males. Is there anything that you can say off the top of your head? Hey, guys, this part of it isn't as bad as it seems, or is there anything that you would give to the guys who watch our show to let them know that there's just one more thing they can think about?
Well, this I think has a two-part kind of answer. Part one is like having an understanding of manhood or what it is to be male. One definition or one meaning of the word male from the Hebrew standpoint means to shoulder, to take care of, to bear, to have control, to have this sense of like I can do this. And so when that is a barrier to why men might not ask for help, or and because it's like, well, I can fix it. If I can't fix it, then I become scared, or I become like, well, what are people going to think about me?
Failure, yeah, etc.
Mm-hmm. So there's an understanding of that sure, like I say this quite a bit to men, that you get an oil change every 3,000 miles.
Yeah.
You go to the mechanic.
Look at her tying in the car business, folks. She's a real true professional here. It's wonderfully done. The oil change.
It's cheaper to get an oil change every 3 months than it is to get a new engine, right?
Yes.
Right. So
yes, that's correct.
So you can think about going to counseling as a checkup, or as a check-in point with somebody who has an idea of what they're talking about. You know, you don't go to your florist to get an oil change. No, you go to your florist to get a flower arrangement, and you go to your car repair person to get your car repaired.
Correct.
So another way of looking at it, so the second part of this is to go along with the metaphor of the oil changes. How is a person going to look at that? Sometimes it's about, not because you're ill or you're sick, it's, I have an important topic that I would wish to talk about, and talk it out, talk it over, so that I have an idea of how I would like to address it or talk about it with someone else, or within my circle. So coming in is like maintenance. It's like an oil change for your brain, right? It's talking about something that's important. Usually if people come in to see me, the first thing I say is, what's important that you'd like to talk about today? What's important for you to talk about today? That gets it going almost right away.
Not because like what's important.
Right, like not like, hey, how's your depression symptoms? I usually don't ask that right away. Like I'll check in maybe later, but
I'm not laughing at any of that, except for the fact that you're absolutely correct. You would not do that.
No.
We would not open up a deal by meeting a customer being like, great, what is it that you came here for, and can you actually afford it? Mm-hmm. Like you wouldn't be the discussion. You would just say, what brings you in today, you know,
right.
or looking at cars, that's so much fun, whatever. Mm-hmm. That's really...
Therapists
really
also might be like a car salesman, in the fact that like a client comes into the office and they're looking to gain something from the meeting, whether that's just like a test drive or
the actual car itself. Maybe they can make a deal.
Exactly. But, you know, you go in, you talk about what is it that you're looking for, what is it that you hope for, and that person sitting across from you, if you've got a good one, will help you to know what your options are and what your choices are.
Again, did I tell you, or did I tell you, the professionalism here is outstanding. It all ties together because as salespeople, what she just talked about is what we should be doing every day. We want to get them on our side, have them understand, listen to their needs. It's all the same thing, but in the same regard, we have to treat ourselves that way. Mm-hmm. You can't be a great sales professional unless you treat your own mind and body in the way that you treat others. I think that's extremely, extremely important. I'm going to tie it up. I'm going to ask you one last thing here as we get off onto this, and I appreciate all the time today. I have it circled a lot of times. Name it is to tame it. Mm-hmm. Here we are in the middle of, to name it, the biggest pandemic craziness that any of us have ever experienced. What is one piece of advice you can give to folks right now to tame it?
I would say to take a deep breath. Take many deep breaths if you have to. If you have a minute to take deep breaths for just a minute, a couple times a day, that's helpful because the brain needs oxygen. If the brain goes into this panic or fear mode, the oxygen is only going to go to the parts of the brain that need it, which is that like flight, fight, or freeze response, those more primitive things that keep you going so that you can get out of danger. What happens is then the oxygen doesn't go to the parts of your brain that allow you to think, make decisions, have understanding, or even being able to formulate words and to help identify what you need in that particular moment. So stopping and taking deep breaths can be really helpful to press pause and put space between, that thing that just happened and your response. So deep breaths gets the brain with the oxygen that it needs.
Wow. Simple. Yeah, I bet you extremely effective. So I hope you guys go out and do it. Air 5, great job. Wonderful work. Thank you so much. Here's the deal, guys. We are going to be coming out with Carbiz Chronicles Season 3. Jessica is our lead-in. You are not going to want to miss next Monday's show. Please tune in. Thank you guys for tuning in today. I told you she's a pro. Any of you have questions for her, I'm happy to get them over to her. Thanks again, and we'll see you again next week.